So your memoir reflects on a lifetime of experiences. What inspired you to write it during the COVID pandemic, and how did that time of isolation shape the themes you explored?
Well, thank you for convening this conversation. I appreciate your taking the time to talk to me about my book, Hindu and Catholic Priest and Scholar. I think it was a number of things. Even before COVID, I was thinking that as I get on in life, it was time to consolidate who I am, what kind of work I do, why I do it. I've been, as of now, a year after the book came out, this is my 41st year teaching at the university level. So I've been around a long time, and looking back, thinking about what I've done, what impact it's had, to explain both to me and to younger people what it's all about. It was coming a time in my life when I thought it would be appropriate to put it down as kind of a narrative of who I am. COVID, as for everybody else, those of us who were, confined by COVID but escaped serious illness, a time for reflection, even teaching online was still in a way of kind of seclusion, and basically to pull it together at a time when life and death is so apparent in our world and our country. So I think those were kind of conducive moments, both where I am in life, and then the COVID time is making it all very vivid and serious, that we have to know what we're doing, we have to know what we're up to.
Was COVID more of a catalyst for you or a disruption?
I think for me, it was probably more, if you have to say it, a catalyst. Um, Being a professor and being able to teach on Zoom, I continued living where I live. I continued teaching my courses. Even, March of 2020, COVID suddenly intervened, and then we picked up the next week on COVID on Zoom teaching. And so it was for a scholar professor, it meant sitting at my desk even more than usual. But it was not the disruption that so many people suffered in terms of their jobs, their living conditions. And I did contract COVID twice, but it was minor in both cases. So I was very fortunate to have no complaints.
And one of the biggest questions is kind of what is religion in that way? How do you go about thinking about religion? What is religion to you? I guess those are two different questions. What is religion? And then what is religion to you?
Well, I think the two are, for me, intertwined, because I'm not the greatest person for a kind of the abstract definition of what religion is. In a sense, you could say that the book, a memoir, is really telling how I've lived religion, how religion is living for me, and therefore how it comes together in terms of agenda, concerns, goals. In some ways, my life is no great mystery. Uh, I made clear at the beginning, growing up Roman Catholic, Irish Catholic, New York, living fairly traditional Catholic life in the 1950s and 60s, um, entering a seminary when I was just 18 years old. That isn't done anymore, but in those days it was still done. So kind of religion is a way of life. I mean, some people discover religion as a way of life. Well, I think most of us have known that all along, that religion could be considered an abstraction or some kind of theoretical frame. But in terms of what matters most, I think it's a way of life. And I think we also have, we're born into religious traditions or not. We grow up with, parents who are members of religious traditions, or nowadays parents who are seekers themselves or fallen away from religion. And then we have choices to make along the way. So as young people, certainly, and then later on at any point in life, do I want to continue with this? Is this still meaningful for the way I live my life? And as I try to describe in the book, for me, it came down to really, after I graduated from college, again as a seminarian, going to Nepal for 2 years was a way of kind of continuing to live Catholic, in the faith I grew up with, to go to teach in a Catholic school in Kathmandu. But all the boys I taught and most of my colleagues on the faculty were Hindu or Buddhist. And therefore, it was, I think, reminding me personally in my life that religions are not kind of ivory towers cut off from the world around them, but that as has been true throughout history, religions are always bumping into one another, intersecting in various ways. So what is religion? It's hard to say. It's more than culture. It's not the same as culture. It's history, but more than history. It's personal choices, but more than personal. It's at some liminal level, I suppose you'd say what people in certain traditions have called encounter with God. Some kind of sense of the transcendent as a person. That can be, parsed in different ways. If one is in a tradition where there is no supreme deity, then you can put it in other terms. But I think it's this worldly, but then also beyond this world by being a sense of something greater, something that even reaches beyond death. And I think that's perhaps why people find religion meaningful as part of even ordinary lives.
You described your life as a double formation, rooted in Catholicism while deeply engaged in Hinduism. How do you define this concept, and what has it taught you about the boundaries of faith?
Yeah, I think thank you. It's a question important, to the structure of the book even. As I was just saying, that in some sense, so I grew up Roman Catholic. At age 22, went off to Nepal to teach high school, and all the boys I taught were Hindu and Buddhist. I think what I learned was that being grounded in a religious tradition, as I was, belonging to the Catholic Church as I do, was in some sense not a barrier to learning interreligiously, but rather it set a very high standard. That to be a Catholic, in a seminary, becoming a Jesuit, member of the Society of Jesus, was pretty high demand in terms of, practicing the religion, studying it, knowing the history, facing ethical questions, and then kind of, relating personally to the words of the Bible, the words of tradition, making all of this kind of come real in one's life. What struck me is then that was a formation as a whole way of life in being a Catholic Christian. And that taught me that if I was going to encounter and learn from, be among people of another religious tradition, it couldn't be superficial. So, it doesn't work, in my view, to say, I am belonging to this tradition, this is who I am, it's part of my life. And then, pick up a few books and learn about another religion, get some statistics, get some, textbook information, and so on. No, one cannot really engage another tradition unless you do it the same way you do it with your own. So if the scriptures, the Bible means something to me, I had to be vulnerable to and open up to, the Hindu texts I was reading, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, devotional poetry, and so on. If being Catholic involves, practice, going, worshiping, then I was very sensitive, although I'm not an ethnographer or a fieldwork scholar, going to temples, being at festivals, seeing how people worship, being in holy places was important for me, and so on. That therefore, I think the second formation, which could never be as extensive or deep as the first, was to try to learn Hinduism in an intimate, personal way that went beyond simply what might meet the qualifications for a PhD or something like that.
So, balancing two distinct traditions without abandoning either is obviously a challenge. Kind of like myself when I'm playing guitar and also trying to play the piano as well. How do you keep both Catholic and Hindu influences alive without diluting their existence and essences?
Yeah, and that's another great question. Thank you for that. Because I think in some ways it requires, being grounded in your own tradition if you have one, um, being open to learning from another, one or more. Some people learn from, many religious traditions, and being aware that it is a tricky thing, and it's in some ways it's impossible, I think, to be truly members of two religions at once. Um, I think to be, the metaphors of crossing over, being a pilgrim, going to the other, and then eventually, for most people, coming home, unless they convert and become a member of the other, the new tradition, that it's a matter of some kind of equilibrium in one's life, digesting what is new, bringing it in. I'm sure when you have guitar and piano, there has to be some kind of a harmony or, resonance of some sort, that it's not simply, chaotic sound. Um, so in some ways, I think for me, it was a matter of finding reasons in my own faith tradition for learning and keeping learning from the other. And then knowing what I'm talking about, that, is maybe taken for granted, but that if we start, settling for obvious similarities, these religions are the same and the basics. Well, if you know a lot, you know that they're not always the same and there are many differences. Or to say that clearly mine is superior to theirs. Well, if you know enough, you realize that that's an untenable position to prove by any kind of knowledge, at least. So I think, it's a learning experience, coming and going, and trying to be honest about who you are, and allowing other people to keep you honest. So, I don't look like I'm from South Asia, and I always, didn't blend in the crowd. When I met with teachers, I didn't look like the natural disciple and so on like that. They kept me honest by reminding me, of my own birthland, my own background, my own family, just as they honor and, care for their own families. And therefore, it seemed to make it easier actually to connect that I, who am a white man from the West, Christian, Catholic, meeting, let's say, a teacher in deep South India, um, much darker skin, a whole different family structure, that we sort of, I think usually, there'd be exceptions, able to appreciate the differences that were part of the encounter and the learning from one another. And that it wouldn't have helped to pretend, oh, we're just the same. Everything is the same between, me and the teacher in Tamil Nadu somewhere. But rather the differences matter because then you encounter like have an I-thou relationship.
Well, what did those differences do for you? Was there an intimidation or insecurity for you being, as you put it, a white person from the West going into deep South India to be with other people? Like, was there a complex there?
I think it is complex. I mean, on one level, I think, if you know your own tradition, if you study another tradition, you can come up with a list of differences that are not negligible, they're not unimportant. Somebody just asked me recently, well, what do you as a Christian think about reincarnation or rebirth? And I think on the one hand, um, I can see that there's no real tradition in Christianity of reincarnation. There are teachers here and there throughout history who've held to that view. But for the most part, Christians have believed God came once into the world in Jesus Christ, one salvation, one life, one death, and that, theories of karma and rebirth are basically fairly different, and that not to pretend that they're the same at some level, I think is important. But what I've also learned over the years is that, unlike some missionaries in the past or theologians in the past who say, well, clearly our view is right, and therefore your view is erroneous, whatever we're talking about, the God you believe in or the practices you engage in or belief about what happens after death. I think I've learned enough to be very reluctant to say things like that. That while I point to the differences and say, well, clearly to someone, you're my good friend, you're a Hindu, I'm a Christian, we've known each other for a long time. There are still differences between our traditions that don't go away. And yet we still manage to be friends. We still manage to talk to one another and learn from one another. And there are certain mysteries that reach beyond death, the unseen realms of the divine also, in which to be 100% certain that we have it right and therefore we can judge the other is a fairly unintelligent view or unwise view to take up. So I think living with a certain kind of ambivalence, a certain kind of paradox, is necessary if one is going to be serious about learning interreligiously. And that's a healthy thing. And I think, therefore, over the years, I was not really threatened. In the book, I mentioned that when I first got to Kathmandu, one of my first, real kind of, you might say, religious experiences was being taken to Dakshin Kali, temple of the goddess, on a Tuesday when there was animal sacrifice. And it was very, in a sense, mundane. It was just an ordinary Tuesday morning. There were no Hollywood, effects going on. It was just people lined up and they had a chicken or a goat, I think. And then animals were sacrificed and the day went on. Um, I could have been horrified by that and, by the blood and so on like that. But it seemed to me a very sacred moment in a sacred place that I think I was able to appreciate. This is definitely not what I grew up with. This is definitely not New York City, at least the part I lived in. But learning from it and seeing how people practice their faith, I think for me was very intuitively beautiful. And instead of being frightened by it or disgusted by it, I said, okay, this is not my faith, but yes, I can learn from this. Yes, there is a holiness here that I need to respect.
Yeah, it's a very explicit example, the animal sacrifice, just on a random Tuesday. There is a very healthy thing that you did, which is, this is just something that happens here, and I have to accept it, and I have to learn from this experience. And how do you think we can import that understanding into, let's say, New York City, where if you were to sacrifice a random animal in the middle of Times Square, people would freak out and start recording TikToks and everything?
Yeah. Well, I think I mean, all kinds of things go on in New York City, so it wouldn't surprise me if there are certain places where animals are sacrificed for various religious reasons. And certainly people are sacrificing animals by killing them and eating them. So that's another form of slaughter of animals.
Mm.
But I think in some ways, there has to be a sense of we understand what we do, and there are reasons that go way back in our families and our culture for doing this and that we then have to be aware that for other people it may not make sense. They may not understand what we do and why we do it. So we're a pujari, a priest from Nepal, from the Dakshin Kali temple, show up in Harvard Square or Times Square to sacrifice an animal. I think people would hopefully remind that pujari not a good idea. That to suddenly show up and without context, background, teaching, in a non-holy place, to be suddenly doing something like that would be very weird. If there was, let's say, and I don't think there is, a regular goddess temple, let's say in the New York area, the Boston area, where animal sacrifice is part, then I think there would have to be some, pedagogy, education, both perhaps for some of the members of the temple about why we do this, but also if the temple's open to visitors, then some kind of a guide or preparation for them to show them what we're up to, why we do it this way, and leading people into it and reminding them if you're not comfortable, no offense if you leave or if you pull out, but hopefully encouraging the people who come not to be, making extreme comments about the barbarianism of this or that and so on. And I think if one looks, at one's own tradition and say, well, there are things here that perhaps other people don't understand. Certainly, if one looks at the Catholic Church, um, even in its good aspects, there are things that people may not understand about what is this thing about the priesthood? Why is it priests can't get married? Why can't women be priests? What is the thing with the bread and the wine at the altar and so on like that? These are all things that they're not as dramatic as animal sacrifice, but that may puzzle people who say, well, we find that's not very American, and we don't think that should go on here. And a realization, therefore, before I throw stones at others, to look at myself and say, maybe there are things about me and my faith tradition that others are not happy with or wouldn't understand. And so too for Judaism and Islam and Buddhism and other traditions. What seems natural to me may seem kind of bizarre to somebody else. But preparing people and not scandalizing people, not being sensational, I think is a real part of what we would hope this would be about.
Do you think there is a limit to what you can understand in and from and by a religion? Like, is there a boundary which you cannot cross? Like, is there just a finite number of things you can understand about any one religion, or is there an infinite amount of understanding contained within every such religion?
Well, I think I would say that on some level, this would be true of life in general, first of all. I mean, I'm old enough now to be, what you might call a lifelong learner. And I've been studying both my own tradition and another tradition, the Hindu tradition, for a very long time. And I've been reading the text in, Latin and Greek and Sanskrit and Tamil and so on all my life, for many years. And I realized that as I get older and, presumably my working time will, decline, that there are so many things I've yet to learn, so many things I don't know about Hinduism, but also about Catholicism. When I come across a book review of a new book about the Middle Ages, Christian Middle Ages, or about the Bible, I realize, well, they didn't teach me that when I was in school. And isn't it amazing how these new things are being discovered? And likewise, with another tradition, particularly if you weren't born into a tradition, you didn't have it in your family, you didn't grow up with it, you're not, I can read Tamil and Sanskrit fairly well, but I'm not a fluent speaker of Tamil. Therefore, there are limits on how far one can get and how far one can get in terms of intuitions, sensitivities, family connections. My family has no Hindu connections. So there are all these kinds of limits that come in. And I think you get older and you realize, well, all this time, I'm 40 plus years out of my PhD program. I can't claim that I'm the master of all things, South Asian or Hindu, or even all things Catholic. Um, but I think that can be taken in two ways. Like, what's the point then? You never got it, so why don't you just stop doing it? Or if you're still interested and still have some kind of drive to learn, then you figure out one more step, two more steps, three more steps. You continue to learn in small ways, realizing that other people are learning in other ways, younger people are learning in other ways, and so on. But the goal of kind of complete knowledge, I think, is it's a dream, a farce of some sort. It's not going to happen for anyone in any field.
Do you think you could have these same understandings if you had pursued, instead of Hinduism, Buddhism or Islam?
I think so. I mean, I have great respect, for the Buddhists I met in Kathmandu, because the Kathmandu Valley is very Buddhist in many ways. Um, the stupas, the shrines of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas and so on. Islam, I've not studied, but I've read in English many passages from the Quran. I've taken students to mosques on Friday for prayer, but it's a world that I sort of peek into and then don't really know. And I think it's one of the great mysteries, you might say, one of the small mysteries in comparative studies, why people incline toward one religious tradition to study rather than another. So for me, from the time I got in Kathmandu on, it's been Hindu traditions of various sorts. Other young people of my age, who were young when I was young, went to Kathmandu and they became very interested in Tibetan Buddhism or Newar Buddhism of the Kathmandu Valley. Other people found, oh, it's definitely Rabbinic Judaism I want to study, or Islam I want to study, or Taoism I want to study. And I think one can look back in one's proclivities, one's sensitivities, one's image of life, why one kind of goes in one way or another. Um, but I think some of the same skills that I've tried to cultivate all these years of, a certain kind of humility, patient learning, if possible, learning the languages of the tradition you study, going to places of worship, visiting countries where that's the predominant faith, and so on. All of this, I think, would apply to Islam, Buddhism, Taoism, Judaism also. Um, Habits of learning. I'm not the kind of person who could say, well, now I've done Hinduism, now I'm going to do Buddhism, or now I'll do Islam. But I think the principles are similar in terms of how one learns.
In both Hindu and Christian traditions, there is a belief that a teacher appears when that they're needed most. So, how have mentors and guides shaped pivotal moments in your career?
Good, interesting question, because I've never really thought of myself as having a guru, like a guide who was like the decisive person in my life. Um, Growing up Catholic again, the parish priests, priests in the seminary, good guides along the way at this point to that point in my life. Many have been helpful to me and have kind of shown me, the next step to take. Also, when I spent early on, I spent 1982 and most of 1983 in Mylapore in Madras, studying with teachers of Mimamsa Vedanta. Then I went back in 92, 93, studying Tamil, the Alvars, the Tamil, Bhakti poets. And in those cases, I had teachers who were, immeasurably valuable to me, who knew so much and were patient enough to work with me who knew so little, that I'm forever grateful to those people, both Christian and Hindu, that I worked with. Um, but in the sense of having like a guide who's like the decisive person, it's rather for me, I think that at various points there was a key person who helped make a difference. So like when I was thinking of part of our studies as young Jesuits was to study or teach in a school. When I tried to make the case that I wanted to go to Nepal or India and teach, they could have said no. We need you here in New York City, so you can't go. That would have made a difference. And sort of wise priest in charge who decided to trust me and let me go my way. Or after I was ordained a Catholic priest in 1978, I didn't want to do a PhD in theology, Catholic theology. I told them I needed to study Sanskrit and other languages and kind of do a South Asia program. And that's what I did at the University of Chicago. And again, they could have said, no, we need a Catholic theologian. You're a Catholic priest to study Catholic theology. But they said, we trust you. Go ahead and do it. And other cases like that in my life where the right person at the right time was very helpful to me. Um, but I don't think I could identify one person as really a guru in my life who continues, except in some, sense of faith that Jesus Christ would be a guru for many people, just as Krishna might be and other such figures in terms of a guide for life, spiritually.
Do you believe that in moments like everything happens for a reason? Could those be the guides?
Yes. I mean, it's a tricky thing to say everything happens for a reason. In one sense, you can say, well, that's clearly, is that true? Because we like to believe we have freedom and that if I choose to do something, like to how I dress today, uh, what I'm doing at now, or what I'll be doing an hour from now, where I go this evening, tomorrow. There are choices we make about what we do, little choices, and then bigger choices about, well, what did you do? What did you choose to do when you were 25 or 35 or 55? Freedom. But then when you look back on your life, it's hard to imagine it could have been otherwise. And so my memoir, Hindu and Catholic Priest and Scholar, in some sense was looking back and seeing my life from when I was young until now and seeing the kind of the flow of continuity that all these pieces fit together and to ask, what would I be like if I hadn't done this or hadn't done that doesn't really work because I am sort of the product of all the things that happened along the way. And if I had never gone to Nepal or never studied Hinduism, I'd be a different kind of person. Um, but I think it may be helpful for people, at least to try, in particularly in difficult situations, to say, this is not the end. So, an earthquake, a flood, the fires in California, these things either have a purpose or they can be for the good in the long run. Not wishing they would happen, wishing they'd never happen, but nonetheless that out of bad things, things can come, out of things that seem to be meaningless, your purpose in life can be further advanced. That kind of thing. I think a kind of a faith or a confidence that life does have a meaning and hold together, which, it could be explained in terms of, as I do, belief in God who has a providence that governs the world, or a belief, in a deity of another tradition who has the same kind of providence, or that karma and rebirth work out over lifetimes. There is a plan to what happens to you and all that. Some kind of sense that it's not meaningless or chaotic, I think is important.
There is like there. How do you, as a young person, or just a person in general, what advice would you have for someone to explore another faith outside their own? A lot of Gen Z maybe don't ascribe to a single faith or don't have very deep faith. Um, so there's a question of how do you find faith in the first place? But if you already have a faith, let's say you're a Christian or you're a Hindu or you're a Muslim and you're interested, how do you even go about doing that? How do you find the confidence? How do you find the faith in understanding?
Yeah. Well, you're right, first of all, about, Gen X and Gen Z, and then I guess younger than Gen Z today, still younger people often grow up with extremely different backgrounds than I did. 'Cause I was pretty much a Catholic in a Catholic family with Catholic grandparents in a Catholic parish, went to Catholic school. It was all fairly coherent, and we just didn't know many people who were not Catholic, and it was all sort of set. But now that, the students I teach, a place like Harvard Divinity School where I teach, are in fact growing up with either, very mixed, some are traditional Catholic, Hindu, Muslim, whatever, but many are of very mixed backgrounds. Even their parents were seekers, committed to one religion, then dropping it, and then trying something else. So by the time they get started, in general, it's a question, well, what has my life been until now? And what would be reasons, religious or philosophical or personal, for wanting to explore yet another religion or try, uh, you know, uh, joining a community of some sort, or becoming a Zen practitioner, or a yogi. There are all kinds of reasons that people have to make, whatever their background may be. But I would say that if somebody is rooted in a religious tradition, let's say a staunch Catholic, a staunch Muslim, a staunch Vaishnava Hindu, let's say, that, to put it negatively, there's no good reason for not being open to learning from another religious tradition.
Mhm.
That having faith and having commitment doesn't somehow become a barrier or a protective wall saying, because I have the faith, I never have to venture outside. I don't have to learn anything from the other, even intellectually, to say, well, because I have the faith, I know it's true, and I know that what they teach is wrong, therefore I have no reason to learn from it. I don't think faith, really gives that kind of security or that kind of protection, but rather one has to be in a position of saying, well, I'm a faithful person. I try to be faithful. I have a religious practice. And in almost everywhere in the world today, you keep rubbing shoulders with people of other faiths. You realize that the people around you, the people you walk down the street, there are people who have different religious traditions around you. People in schools, people in my classroom. Often at Harvard Divinity School, I'll have 7, 8, 10 different religious affiliations in the classroom, at least, and the diversity is incredible, and the faculty is also very diverse. Um, and therefore, to make sense of the world as a religious person, you have to have some way of making sense of the other religions around you. And a certain kind of fundamentalism might be, yes, we're good and they're evil. Ours is true and theirs is wrong. But I think for most people, if they actually have learned something from life or know something about the world around them, realize that there's a lot to be learned before you can even imagine making a judgment. And that it's not an honor to one's own faith to be dismissive of other people's faith. There's no kind of magic sense of we have the right, they have the wrong. Um, and then to put it in very, personal terms, I suppose, I've never found my sense that the God of my tradition was pushing me to be judgmental about other faith traditions. It was more a sense of, and this is the modern Catholic Church, and let's say the last 60 years, go out and learn, go out and at least be good neighbors. And then there are many issues in life where people of different faiths can and should work together. The environment, gun violence, what's going on in schools, international problems, wars around the world. People of faith should not say, well, I'm sorry, I only care about the people of my faith and you can care about the people of your faith. No, people of faith have to work together in the world. And then if you're intelligent and have questions, you can't arbitrarily draw a line and say, my questions only go as far as the end of my tradition and stop. Like I only know about the Bible or the Catholic tradition, because if you know Judaism, you have to know the rabbinic tradition. If you know about Jesus Christ, you have to know about how Islam thinks about Jesus Christ, or 500 years of Hindus thinking about Jesus Christ. Everything it kind of explodes and opens up. And it's not a good point of faith to say, I'm now, because I have faith, I'm going to close my mind. I'm going to cut off all questions. So it's a learning process. That's all, so that's all I think in place. The other thing I would say is that it can be a great joy. Um, I have, for all these 50 plus years now, learned a lot from studying Hinduism, reading the texts, going to temples, having friends, listening to music, and on and on. And that this is not it's not a duty only or a task only. It's very pleasing, very beautiful, very kind of encouraging. That gives me strength to go on. And I think people who have one faith tradition shouldn't be afraid to learn, because they may find they enjoy it, and that learning from other traditions can be a great boost to even to one's own faith.
The subtitle of your memoir, A Love Story, reflects your gratitude and passion for your work. What do you hope this love conveys to readers about your journey?
Well, I think, that's very important. And thanks for pointing to that, a love story, because it seemed to me that when I was, writing the book and then coming to its conclusion, or coming to concluding the writing of it, that it was really asking myself, what held this together all these years? So I'm 74, I'll be 75 this year. I've been a Catholic priest for um, 47 years almost. I've been a Jesuit for 57 years or so. Um, and asking, well, how did that all hold together? How can I do when I'm older what I was doing a very long time ago? Um, I started, my first encounter with Hinduism was when I was 22, when I went to Nepal. How is it that 50 plus years later, I can still be interested? I've been teaching, as I said before, my 41st year in the classroom at the university level. Where do I get the energy, to keep going? Um, I think there's a certain sense of, you know, intellectual interest, challenges, enjoyment. But I decided that really what it was about is kind of a love that goes very deep. That early in my life, I experienced the love of God very personally, and found that everything given to me in my life was kind of a exchange in love, symbolically with God, but also exchange in love with my neighbors, with my students, with my elders, in this country, United States, in India, learning across borders. There was a certain kind of intimacy and love and a bond that was established that just kept me going over the years. Um, and in a sense, I've considered my life very fortunate that I had a strong sense as a child of being loved by my parents, by my siblings, family. I didn't grow up in tragic circumstances or abandoned or anything. And that sense of a love that gives you a way to not be afraid of the world around you, but that to really have a strong sense that this is good, and that learning from the world can be a good thing. So that's what I was trying to communicate, from the beginning of the book right to the last page. I think I end with a quotation from the New Testament. It's not so much that we love God, but that God loved us first. And that sense of the love is not a notional thing only or simply an act of the will, but it's really a sense that all of this is about a certain kind of interconnectedness and love where we resonate across all the boundaries. And that love is a kind of vitality, it's a kind of life force that keeps us going. And at my current age, I'm still going until I don't, until I'm not going. But I think the love is a good way to talk about how it all feels when I look back over it.
Yep. Let's end on love. Where can we find your book?
So my book, Hindu and Catholic Priest and Scholar, published by T&T Clark, Bloomsbury. You can go to the Bloomsbury website, I think bloomsbury.com, and get it with a discount there. The hardcover, the paperback, the ebook, the PDF, or you can go to a standard online source like Amazon or Barnes and Nobles, and you'll easily find it. So Clooney, Hindu and Catholic Priest and Scholar. And I've gotten good responses to it. I think people do enjoy the book, and I hope that some of your listeners might be inspired to pick it up and take a look. And thank you
Absolutely.
for
Well,
doing
Dr.
this.
Clooney, thank you.
Okay.